Out front tonight, Frank Bruni, New York Times columnist, Julie Hirschfeld-Davis, she's a New York Times White House reporter, and Shan Wu, he's a former federal prosecutor. Julie, if I could start with you. Giuliani telling CNN today, as we were just saying, they're working on this report, this pre-buttal, as it were, even though we don't know what Mueller's conclusions are going to be right now. I mean, as we were saying, this is a PR document, which appears to be Trump's strategy here, continuing strategy. But this poll we see today, with most Americans continuing to support the investigation, it seems that strategy is not working for most Americans.
Well, I think that's true right now, but it is also the case that other than the president's tweets and some of his offhanded comments and what Rudy Giuliani has been saying on the news, we don't know the full extent of what they're going to say to rebut what Mueller may or may not have. But as you mentioned earlier, this is obviously as much a PR effort as it is a strictly legal or substantive effort, because they don't know what Mueller is going to say. They don't know the extent of what he has. That is the big worry here, is that they don't know what is coming from the special counsel's office. And they are obviously looking toward the potential for an impeachment proceeding, and not just hoping to persuade the public, but hoping to persuade members of Congress that there's nothing here.
Frank, among a series of, if not stunning numbers, bad numbers for the president in this poll, 53% to 35%. 53% believe Trump has tried to interfere with Mueller's investigation in a way that amounts to obstruction of justice. Notable there. And let me just remind folks of something that the president said last night.
Our Justice Department and our FBI have to start doing their job and doing it right and doing it now. Because people are angry. People are angry. What's happening is a disgrace. And at some point, I wanted to stay out, but at some point, if it doesn't straighten out properly, I want them to do their job. I will get involved, and I'll get in there if I have to.
53% of Americans believe he's obstructing justice. That certainly doesn't help his case.
No, maybe they're seeing clips like that, and maybe they're reading his Twitter feed. You know, I mean, at a certain point, this has been an endless, steady drumbeat. And I think his whole theory has been, if I keep saying it over and over again, it will eventually drill in, and Americans will begin to repeat almost as if a mantra what I'm saying. I think maybe some Americans are picking up on the fact that that drumbeat itself is a sort of attempt to obstruct justice. That, you know, to keep it new and to keep adding things. He talks about firing Jeff Sessions. He talks about this. He talks about that. All of those things add up to an attempt to make something stop that clearly from this poll, a majority of Americans feel needs to go on. And it does need to go on, because the matter of Russian interference and the possibility that there was Russian cooperation with a presidential candidate, that's something we have to get a final and definitive answer to. And I do think a majority of Americans understand that's what Robert Mueller's probe is about.
And it's been interesting to watch because Mueller's support has actually been growing in recent polls after having come down for a bit. Shan, you have a lot of experience with cases like this, but this Giuliani document, is this a good use of the lawyer's time in terms of a legal defense, or do you see this purely as a public relations defense?
Ultimately, it's a good legal defense because they would have a chance to counter whatever's in the report. Mm-hmm. When I worked on an independent counsel investigation, it took months and months to prepare that report, and then people took a long time to review it and put in their comments and objections. From a PR standpoint, he says that it's half done. It's more like it's half baked. I mean, you know, as Julie pointed out, he has no idea what he's responding to. And if they really are putting in, you know, hundreds of man hours rebutting every possible allegation against them, I mean, they're just making the government's case for them. They're setting up the, you know, straw man and then trying to knock it down. So it's really not going anyplace legally at this point. It's too early.
Giuliani, the president's lawyer, of course, he called the patent plea an irrelevant indictment. And I imagine for folks at home, it's hard to follow these events because it comes out in dribs and drabs. They're not necessarily names or even crimes that people at home are aware of. But this does get to foreign money coming into the Trump inauguration, which is the equivalent of a campaign contribution from abroad.
Well, it absolutely does, and it also fills out a little bit, although we certainly don't have the whole picture, but it fills out the picture of people around President Trump and then candidate Trump and the Trump campaign, or that was President-elect Trump at the time of his inauguration, obviously, that they had these connections, these deep connections to Russian oligarchs, to prominent Russians. One of the people whom Patton had a very close connection to was a Russian-American lobbyist who was at the Trump Tower meeting. You start to see some of these ties becoming more apparent, and while we can't know what the connections may be, it certainly does raise a lot more questions, and it shows that the Mueller probe is going in a lot of different directions, and again, how much he and his investigators know that the president and his team may not be aware that they know.
And we're getting to the point, Frank, where you have half a dozen folks who are cooperating with this investigation and folks who were involved. I mean, from very close individuals, Rick Gates, who was, of course, the deputy campaign chairman, to someone like Patton, who was at least involved, it seemed, in some money moving back and forth. You've covered this administration for some time. How worried is the president and are his advisors about that cooperation? Because, of course, they don't know what kind of goods they're given on him. Yeah.
I think they're very worried, and I think the answer is stuff we saw earlier in this segment. I mean, the way Donald Trump is speaking at the microphone, his claims are getting ratcheted up. We've gone from witch hunt to rigged witch hunt. You know, we've gone to a conspiracy between the Justice Department and the media. The fact that Giuliani and his folks are preparing this, I mean, all of these are signs of how worried to the point of panic they are, and they should be, because the news today, I think, is that Robert Mueller's investigation, and every time there's new development, we see this, is as thorough as they come and is reaching in as many directions. And if there is something there to be found, it's going to be found, and that's what has really settled into this White House, and that's what they're reacting
If
to.
there's anybody who's tuning out all the noise, it's Robert Mueller, just the way he does business. Shan, in the midst of all this, you have a lawyer change for the president. Of course, Don McGahn is leaving. We have a second name as a potential successor to McGahn, a source telling CNN today that Pat Cipollone, a seasoned litigator, former Justice Department official during President George H.W. Bush's administration, is now under consideration by this president. A tough job for someone to come into at this stage. We know that McGahn, it wasn't always a sunny relationship with the president. Does anybody want that job?
Well, I'm sure someone wants the job, but you're right. It's a very tough job to come into, and really, he has to turn things around. I mean, the big problem for Team Trump's legal strategy is that they can't execute anything. You know, some of the early leanings made sense, Cobb and Dowd wanting to cooperate, but they didn't take the final step and execute that, which would have been to have Trump sit down early. With Giuliani's more PR confrontational strategy, he's just creating more and more problems for the president as he gets out there tweeting these things, more and more wildly inconsistent statements. They need somebody who can take charge, sit everybody down and say, this is what we're doing. And it's not an excuse to say it's a tough client to handle and a lot of different people. They got to do it that way, do it the right way.
Well, if you can find someone who can tell the president that successfully, that'll be interesting. Shan, Julie, Frank, thanks so much. Out front next.